Oscar and Lucy, Chapter 3. Enter the Prof. To describe my early years as a psychologist, I have to invoke the term beloved of P.G. Wodehouse fans, unseen forces were at work. You'll see why in a minute. Possessed of a PhD based on a thesis written rapidly to avoid starvation, I knew a good deal about memory. Or to be strictly truthful, I knew a good deal more about forgetting. I was on excellent terms with my benevolent supervisor. His first name was Harry. He had spent happy days in the immediate post-war years in Australia at Melbourne University, combining teaching psychology with raising sheep. Yes, the parallel struck me as well. Harry spoke feelingly about that egalitarian paradise where every citizen could have their time at the uni. It would bring tears to his eyes. The idea of mass education seemed extraordinarily exciting to me at that time, probably because I was young and had not thought about it very much. The prospect of the whole world sharing my enthusiasm for retroactive inhibition, you'll have to look it up, I'm afraid, seemed exciting beyond belief. One afternoon, over a cup of tea, I was rash enough to share this enthusiasm with Harry. He took it as evidence of my long-awaited political awakening, and the conversation ended with his rubbing his hands together and saying, "I'll see whether I can get you a job there. You'll like it." He was on his way out of the room, but I'm pretty sure that's what he said. Thus it came about that some 4 hectic months later, my new wife and I were planning to emigrate to Australia. Believe it or not, you could do this for 10 quid each, on condition that you didn't come back. Initially allocated a berth on an Italian liner, my case was upgraded to air travel because I had a job to go to. The italic here is to illustrate how this phrase became a motif in my cloistered life at that time. Now, you're probably imagining lengthy negotiations with my future employer. You imagine the frustration of airmail exchanges in days before email, indeed at a time when possessing a domestic computer would have seemed a ridiculous fancy. You're thinking perhaps that lawyers were involved, eagerly striking out phrases, inserting codicils or whatever it is they do, until a contract could eventually be signed. Such is the power of recollection. You may even remember the pen involved. Perhaps it was my Parker pen with the gold nib. Of course, you would be quite wrong about all this. Certainly life at that time was concerned with the practicalities of shipping my new wife and myself to the other side of the world, together with all we possessed. Not a great deal, by the way. But the actual job when I got there concerned me hardly at all. After all, I could call myself Doctor now, and Harry had received a letter one day from somebody he called the Prof. I didn't actually possess a copy of this letter, photocopiers not having been invented, but Harry had read out the critical bits one morning over a cup of tea. You will have heard the previous chapter, so caveat emptor, but from memory the bit in the letter went something like, "Yes, this chap sounds interesting. We've been thinking of building up our experimental side. I think we should find him something. There's always tutor jobs going." Well, that's the gist of it. It was very nice to be thought interesting. I was almost tempted to take up smoking. Now, before you run away with the idea I was being a bit naive, I should point out that Harry took it on himself to offer an extended exegesis on his letter and its true import. He explained this was how the academic dog wagged its tail. Letters are written pointing out the merits of this or that favoured protégé, until eventually they find their place. It all seemed a bit haphazard to me, but as I mentioned, I was young at the time. In my case, I warmed to this prof chap, inasmuch as he'd been perceptive enough to see my merits and find me interesting on so little evidence. Briefly, I was not so much wet behind the ears as wet all over, the result of passing through life to that point with the sole objective of keeping up with the scholarly literature on memory and not much else. Really, virtually nothing else. Indeed, it's an enduring mystery to me how I had managed to acquire a wife. And if you have difficulty imagining this innocent cast into a cruel and uncaring world and wonder how he could possibly have survived, it's a difficulty I share. An appeal to unseen forces, as I say, is the best I can offer for the time being. So the passage was booked, and at all suitable times, and they were many, believe me, this being something of an Australian obsession, the mantra, "I have a job to go to," was repeated. And thus it came to pass I met the prof. My somewhat put-upon wife and I arrived at Flinders Street railway station, a very imposing affair in downtown Melbourne, extremely early one morning in a January heat wave. Later that afternoon, I took a tram ride to the equally imposing psychology department and reported for work. I didn't actually expect to begin that very day, you understand. That would have been naive. I imagined certain formalities, perhaps a form or two to be filled in. As luck would have it, that day the prof was in. Up to that time I had had limited experience of elevated academics. Those I knew were nearly always in, reading or drinking tea or combining the two activities. Harry, for example, was so much always in that I never knew him to be anywhere else. Apparently, it was not so with the prof. Having extracted my name, an early opportunity to brandish my doctor, and my address, I was told I was lucky. The means of this telling be so severe, a little unease entered my breast. I stood awkwardly in the vast outer office, suddenly imagining I'd been written into the second reel of one of those Hollywood movies where the ingenuous danseuse, armed only with her innocence and her long legs, accidentally walks right into the office of the biggest agent in town, the one nobody ever sees, the one with the cigar. It was a bit like that, although without the legs. After an interminable wait, I was ushered in by the dragon secretary and stood before the great man himself. I can only assume the prof had little on that afternoon, and the notion of seeing me clearly had comic possibility, given the story I told the dragon. We got off to rather a halting start, the prof and I, because he could not remember writing to Harry. Indeed, his questions were clearly designed to determine who exactly Harry was. He managed a slight frown, suggesting if he worked at it, the name might come to him. It was only when I raised the matter of my imminent employment that little silences started to fall into our exchanges. Some of these were quite long. There appeared to be what psycholinguists term a conflict of presuppositions. However you wrap it up, it's best that presuppositions should not clash where it's a matter of having a job, or, in my case, not having one. I confess my recollection of the rest of that meeting is hazy. The conversation morphed into a discussion of memory and went on for some time. I recall mentioning interesting research on severe trauma and anterograde memory loss. I sat down at that point to avoid making it seem too personal, but work on memory and shell shock would keep worming its way in. I'm afraid the details are gone. Only the emotional tone is preserved. I would characterize this as anxiety, except hysterical panic seems more apposite. Not nice anyway, and it would do me a favour if it went the same way as the details. But alas, there are some things you can't forget. Not that the fault lay with the prof, you understand. That's rather the point. In our rented rooms that evening, I explained 3 things to my wife. I can't swear to the order, but they covered the fact that Harry had possibly exaggerated his job-finding abilities, that the prof was rather a formidable character, and that I didn't appear to have any immediate prospects of gainful employment. She had spent the afternoon dealing with an Antipodean spider of such prodigious size she'd initially taken it to be a discarded toy, until it walked up the wall, that is. It was just one of those days. Frankly, I felt like having a really good cry. 2 days later, I got a short letter from somebody I eventually worked out must have been the dragon herself. It was bulky, because there was a lengthy contract of employment enclosed, in duplicate, subject only to my providing proof of my PhD. I was offered a job. The letter pointed out that the 3 unpaid weeks before the job started could usefully be spent familiarising myself with the department. The key to my room could be collected during office hours from the technical services officer. I was not invited to visit the prof. Indeed, there was no indication he'd interested himself in the matter at all. Now, you may think in the real world things don't evolve like this, that there must be a backstory, that it's all a bit peculiar. But they do, and there is, and you're right. For the moment, think of unseen forces. For myself, had I been better read, I would have been thinking about angels, but I thought of no such thing. I dutifully filled in my 3 unpaid weeks, found my PhD certificate, and began work as a senior tutor in psychology in the University of Melbourne, my first academic job. The prof's name was Oscar.